The whole neighborhood laughed when the old veteran wrapped his cabin in glass, and now they know why. A retired soldier in Duluth, Minnesota, wearing his red and black buffalo plaid flannel, gambled everything on a strange idea no one believed in. With only his loyal German shepherd by his side, he built a transparent shell around his weather-beaten home, hoping it might save him from another deadly winter. But when the worst blizzard in years slammed into town, and his dog refused to leave the warm, glowing space between the glass walls, neighbors began knocking on his door, desperate and shaking from the cold. What that winter revealed would silence every laugh, humble the loudest critics, and turn one man's grief into a lesson an entire town would never forget. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter descended on Duluth like a sentence handed down by Lake Superior, the wind slicing low across frozen streets, snow piling deep enough to swallow boots, the cold pressing against skin as if determined to leave its name behind. Walter Hayes stood outside his cabin, before dawn breath rising in slow, measured clouds, the kind of breathing learned long ago when panic was dangerous. He was in his late 60s, tall but slightly stooped, his shoulders permanently rounded from decades of carrying weight, first rucksacks and rifles, later grief. His face was deeply lined, the lines not soft, but carved as if time had worked him with a dull blade. A square jaw sat beneath a trimmed gray beard that never quite looked neat no matter how carefully he cut it, and his eyes, a pale steel blue, held the distant focus of a man who had learned to watch horizons instead of people. Over everything he wore the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, faded at the elbows, stiff with age, buttoned all the way up even indoors. It was not a fashion choice. It was armor. At his side stood Ranger, a German shepherd nearing 9 years old, large even by the breed's standards, with a broad chest, powerful hind legs, and a coat thick enough to collect snow like frost on pine branches. His muzzle had begun to gray, but his amber eyes were sharp and restless, constantly scanning the tree line, the road, the cabin door, as if the world might still try something foolish. Ranger had learned Walter's silences the way other dogs learned commands. When Walter stopped moving, Ranger stayed close. When Walter stared too long at nothing, Ranger leaned against his leg, solid and warm, reminding him where his body still was. The cabin itself sat at the edge of town, not far enough to be wilderness, but far enough that the city pretended it wasn't responsible for what happened there. It was a simple structure of old logs and white chinking, built by hands that had valued speed over elegance. Walter had moved into it years earlier, back when his wife Evelyn was still alive, back when the winters felt survivable because there was someone waiting inside. Evelyn Hayes had been a small woman, barely reaching Walter's shoulder, with chestnut brown hair she wore in a loose braid and skin pale enough to freckle even under weak northern sun. She had smiled easily, but worried quietly, and when winter came, she always checked the firewood twice, sometimes 3 times, just to be sure. The storm that took her had arrived early, the kind of storm that arrived without asking permission. Walter had gone into town for supplies, confident he would be back before the temperature dropped too far. By the time he returned, snow had erased distance, and 20 feet between the cabin door and the woodpile might as well have been 20 miles. He found Evelyn on the floor, near the hearth, wrapped in every layer she owned, her face strangely calm, as if sleep had simply decided to stay. The fire had died. The cold had not. That moment rewired something inside Walter that no doctor could name. Since then, he did not trust winter, and he did not trust things that depended on luck. That was why the frame now rising around the cabin mattered. Walter had begun weeks earlier hauling old windows salvaged from demolished houses, cracked panes discarded by contractors, sheets of mismatched glass scavenged and cleaned with careful patience. He set posts into frozen ground, measured space with a surveyor's precision, learned not from school but from necessity, leaving a deliberate gap between the cabin walls and the growing skeleton of wood and glass. Ranger watched from a few steps back, ears twitching, whenever the hammer rang too sharply, as if loud sounds still meant trouble. The neighbors noticed quickly. Duluth was not a small town when it came to opinions, and Walter's project gave them something to chew on through the long winter. Sarah Collins was the first to stop and stare openly. She lived 2 houses down, a tall, thin woman in her early 40s, with wind-reddened cheeks and blonde hair perpetually escaping from under her knitted hat. She was practical, sharp-tongued, but not cruel by nature, the kind of person who spoke her thoughts before considering whether they needed saying. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets, eyeing the glass panels leaning against the posts. "Walter," she called, voice cutting through the wind, "you building a greenhouse or a fish tank?" Her mouth curved upward halfway to a smile. Others were less gentle. Mark Jensen, a broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh and a habit of leaning too close when he talked, shook his head openly one afternoon. "Glass won't last one real storm," he said to no one in particular. "Whole thing'll shatter like a beer bottle on ice." Someone else added that grief made people do strange things. Another joked about Walter trying to live inside a snow globe. Laughter carried easily in the cold air, brittle and sharp. Walter did not answer. He rarely did. Words had never been his preferred tools, and after Evelyn's death, he had learned that explaining pain only invited people to step on it. He kept working his movements steady, deliberate, the way they had been when hesitation could get someone killed. Each nail driven was a refusal to accept that what had happened was inevitable. Each pane of glass lifted into place was an argument with the cold itself. Inside, his thoughts were quieter than they had been in months, focused not on what he had lost, but on what he was trying to prevent. He had spent nights watching how sunlight crept across the cabin floor on clear days, how even weak winter light carried warmth if given the chance to stay. He had noticed how Ranger always chose the brightest patch of sun to lie in, instinctively seeking heat where it lingered longest. Walter trusted instincts. They had kept him alive once. Ranger sensed the tension around them, even when Walter pretended not to. When laughter drifted too close, the dog lifted his head, a low sound vibrating in his chest, not aggressive, just present. People tended to step back after that. There was something about Ranger's stillness that suggested he did not bluff. As the frame rose higher, the jokes grew louder, almost desperate, as if the town needed Walter to fail to reassure itself that winter still followed the old rules. Walter felt that pressure, the unspoken demand, to accept loss as normal, to burn more wood, to suffer quietly, to stop trying to outthink the season. Some nights he lay awake listening to the wind scrape ice against glass, wondering if he was wrong, if the storm would punish him for daring to hope. But then he would remember Evelyn's hands tucked uselessly under her arms, the wood so close it mocked him, and the doubt hardened into resolve. By the time the first heavy snowfall came, the outline of the structure was unmistakable. The cabin stood inside it like a heart, protected by ribs, fragile perhaps, but no longer exposed. Walter stepped back one evening, snow collecting on his shoulders, Ranger sitting at his heel, and for the first time since the storm that took Evelyn, he allowed himself to think not about surviving winter, but about changing it. The laughter behind him faded into the wind, thin and temporary. The cold, he knew, was listening. Walter Hayes did not argue because arguing had never saved anyone. He had heard louder sounds than laughter in his life, rifle cracks splitting desert air, helicopter blades beating panic into dust, the long, unnatural silence that followed when a voice did not answer the radio. Compared to those, the neighbor's jokes were just another kind of wind, unpleasant, but survivable. He kept his head down, and his hands busy letting the cold sting his knuckles until sensation narrowed into focus. Ranger stayed close, pacing slow circles around him, nails crunching softly on ice, a quiet perimeter patrol learned from years of watching Walter prepare for threats that never came with warning. The idea did not arrive all at once. It crept in the way winter itself did, gradual and inevitable. Walter began noticing things he had once ignored. On rare, clear days, sunlight slipped through the cabin's small, south-facing window and pooled on the floorboards, warming the wood enough that Ranger always chose that spot to lie down. Walter watched the dog stretch belly exposed, soaking in heat, as if he understood physics better than most men. The warmth never lasted long. By late afternoon, the light shifted, and the cold reclaimed the room with quiet authority. That loss irritated Walter more than the cold itself. Heat was arriving. The problem was that it refused to stay. At night, he replayed Evelyn's final hours without meaning to. Not the dramatic moments people imagined, but the small, cruel details, the firewood stacked neatly outside the door only steps away, the way the storm had erased distance and turned effort into danger. He understood then that the cabin had failed her not because it was weak, but because it was exposed. The walls bled warmth, constantly surrendering to the cold without resistance. Burning more wood had only delayed the outcome. That was when the thought settled fully into place. If the enemy was heat loss, then survival was not about fighting harder, but about refusing the fight altogether. Walter began sketching late at night, charcoal scratching across scrap plywood salvaged from a torn-down shed. He drew the cabin first, then a second outline around it, leaving space between the two. He imagined that space filled not with furniture or storage, but with air still trapped, warmed by the sun before it ever touched the cabin walls. He remembered greenhouses from years ago, structures people dismissed as fragile and impractical, yet somehow capable of growing tomatoes in snow. Glass let light in. Light carried heat. And if that heat could be slowed even slightly, it might change everything. Ranger watched these nighttime rituals with quiet seriousness, head resting on his paws, eyes following Walter's hands. When Walter paused too long, lost in memory, Ranger rose and nudged his knee firm but gentle, pulling him back into the present. The dog's coat had thickened with age, silver threading through the black along his shoulders, and Walter often found himself resting a hand there, feeling warmth that did not escape so easily. He thought about how Ranger survived winter not by fighting it, but by growing into it, adapting without complaint. The next morning, Walter measured the cabin again, pacing distances with the precision of someone who trusted his own stride more than any ruler. He marked the ground with stakes, calculating clearances, imagining snow drifting against glass instead of logs. The structure would have to stand on its own, independent of the cabin, tall enough to clear the roof, strong enough to hold weight that winter always delivered without mercy. It would need ventilation, too. Walter knew heat could become dangerous if trapped without control. His time in the service had taught him that pressure, whether physical or human, always found a weak point eventually. Sarah Collins noticed the change before most others did. She stopped by one afternoon, boots-dusted white scarf wrapped too tight around her neck. Up close, her sharpness softened. Her pale blue eyes were curious rather than mocking. "You're serious about this," she said, not as a question. Walter nodded once. Sarah studied the charcoal sketches laid out on a crate, her brow furrowing. "Looks complicated," she admitted. She wasn't unkind, just honest. Practical people respected effort even when they doubted results. "If it works," she added after a moment, "it'll be smarter than any of us standing out here freezing." Walter gave the smallest hint of a smile, the kind that barely disturbed his beard. Not everyone shared Sarah's restraint. Mark Jensen passed by again, laughter, loud breath fogging the air. He made another comment about shattered glass and wasted money, shaking his head like a man disappointed in a lost cause. Walter felt the words hit him not as pain, but as pressure. The doubt crept in that night, whispering questions he could not fully answer. Glass was fragile. Money was finite. Failure would not just be embarrassing, it would leave him colder than before. He lay awake listening to the cabin creak, wondering if he was building hope out of the same materials winter always destroyed. The doubt broke the next morning, when Walter opened the door and felt the full weight of the cold slam into his chest. Ranger hesitated at the threshold, ears flattening briefly before stepping out. Walter remembered Evelyn's last attempt to cross that same distance, remembered how quickly the storm had erased her strength. The memory sharpened his resolve into something almost calm. He would rather fail trying to change the rules than succeed at obeying them. Selling his belongings was easier than he expected. Old tools he no longer used, spare furniture, even a few keepsakes Evelyn had loved. But he could not bear to see every day. Each sale felt like a small amputation, but the pile of cash grew tangible proof that the idea could move from charcoal to wood and glass. Walter salvaged windows from demolition sites, negotiated quietly with contractors who were happy to be rid of imperfect panes. Ranger rode in the truck bed when allowed, ears high, watching the city pass, with the solemn curiosity of an aging guard dog surveying unfamiliar territory. As the materials stacked beside the cabin, the laughter shifted tone. It became nervous, edged with something like anticipation. Walter noticed it, but did not dwell. He spent his evenings refining measurements, adjusting angles, thinking through snow loads and wind pressure. He imagined the first storm testing his structure, imagined glass flexing instead of shattering, imagined a pocket of warmth where winter expected surrender. For the first time since Evelyn's death, the future felt like something he could engage with instead of endure. The chapter of grief was not closed, but it had been rewritten. Loss had become instruction. Pain had turned into design. As Walter drove the first post into frozen ground, Ranger standing guard beside him, he understood that this was no longer about surviving winter alone. It was about refusing to let the cold dictate how the living should live. The work truly began in midsummer, when the sun was high, and the air smelled of cut grass and lake water. But every decision Walter Hayes made was aimed at a future ruled by ice. He dug post holes deep enough to mock frost itself, swinging the shovel with a rhythm that came from long habit rather than strength. Each strike sent a dull ache through his shoulders and down into his wrists, but pain had become a familiar companion, one that could be tolerated as long as it served a purpose. The ground resisted him with stones and dense clay, and Walter welcomed the resistance. It reminded him that structures meant to last were never built easily. By July, the skeletal outline of the greenhouse began to rise around the cabin. Thick posts stood like sentries, measured and braced with care, their alignment checked and rechecked, until Walter was satisfied they would not shift when the earth froze and thawed. He worked alone most days, shirt darkened with sweat, the red and black flannel jacket tied around his waist like a discarded flag. His gray beard grew rougher as the weeks passed, and the lines on his face deepened not from age but from focus. Ranger shadowed him constantly, the dog's broad back collecting dust, and saw shavings, his ears flicking at every unfamiliar sound. At 8 years old, Ranger moved more deliberately now, but his instincts were sharp. Whenever Walter climbed the ladder to bolt a beam into place, Ranger planted himself below, staring up as if his presence alone could prevent a fall. The neighbors' curiosity grew as the frame expanded. Some treated the site like a slow-moving parade. Others came with folded arms and narrowed eyes, measuring failure in advance. Sarah Collins returned often, sometimes bringing iced coffee in the mornings or lemonade in the afternoons. Up close, she looked older than her years, the skin around her eyes weathered by sun and wind, her blonde hair pulled into a practical ponytail streaked with early gray. She was not sentimental by nature, but she understood work. "You've got patience," she said one afternoon, watching Walter align a beam for the third time. "Most people quit when things don't look right fast enough." Walter shrugged. Patience to him was simply refusing to rush what mattered. Mark Jensen came too, though less frequently now. His jokes had lost their edge, replaced by a louder laughter that sounded defensive. He stood with hands on his hips, beard thick and uneven eyes darting over the growing structure. "Looks expensive," he said once, not quite meeting Walter's gaze. Walter nodded. It was expensive. Every pane of glass leaned against the frame represented hours of labor traded for money that would not come back easily. Installing the glass proved to be the true test. Walter learned quickly that glass did not forgive impatience. Each pane had to be seated, gently supported, evenly sealed carefully against air and water. The first one took nearly an hour. By the third, his hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the concentration required to keep pressure balanced. Ranger sensed the tension and stayed perfectly still, eyes fixed on Walter's hands, as if willing them steady. When the pane finally settled into place without cracking, Walter exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. Not every attempt ended cleanly. Late one afternoon, with clouds building and wind beginning to pick up, a sudden gust rattled the frame just as Walter lifted a pane into position. The glass slipped, struck the edge of the wood, and shattered with a sharp, crystalline crack that echoed across the yard. The sound froze Walter where he stood. For a moment, the laughter he had endured seemed to crystallize in that noise. Ranger barked once, a sharp warning, then went silent, standing between Walter and the scattered shards. Walter crouched slowly, picking up pieces with bare hands, until thin lines of blood appeared across his fingers. He did not curse. He simply cleaned the area, wrapped his hand, and reached for another pane. The work stretched into weeks, then months. Walter's palms hardened, blistered skin replaced by callus, each layer a record of effort. He built doors that fit snugly, their hinges reinforced to withstand winter winds. He left deliberate gaps low to the ground for controlled airflow, trusting that stillness, not stagnation, was the goal. At night, he lay in bed, listening to the new structure creak as it settled, learning its sounds the way sailors learned the moods of a ship. Ranger slept with one ear lifted, adjusting his position whenever the wood spoke too loudly. By early autumn, the greenhouse enclosed the cabin completely. From a distance, it looked unreal, a transparent shell rising from the yard like a mirage. Sunlight poured through the glass during the day, warming the air trapped between structure and cabin. Walter noticed the difference immediately. He could step into the space between the glass and the logs and feel the temperature shift, subtle but unmistakable. It was not warmth yet, not the kind that banished winter, but it was a promise. The reactions changed almost overnight. Neighbors no longer laughed openly. They stood quietly now, studying the structure, curiosity replacing certainty. Even Mark Jensen's comments softened into questions. Sarah brought a chair one afternoon and sat watching Walter work, her expression thoughtful. "Looks like it's holding," she said. Walter nodded again. Holding was the first requirement of survival. Ranger seemed to understand the significance before anyone else did. He chose the greenhouse space as his preferred resting place, lying stretched out on the packed earth, eyes half closed, soaking in the trapped warmth. Walter watched him one evening and felt something loosen inside his chest, a knot he had carried since Evelyn's death. This space was already doing what it was meant to do. It was changing the rules. As the first cold nights of fall arrived, Walter made final adjustments, sealing small gaps, reinforcing joints, testing doors again and again. His body ached constantly now, but it was a clean ache, earned and purposeful. When he finally stepped back to look at the completed structure, he saw more than wood and glass. He saw months of effort made visible, grief reshaped into something that might outlast him. The transparent walls caught the last light of the day, glowing faintly as the sun dipped behind the trees. Ranger sat beside him, tail resting on the ground, both of them facing the coming winter without flinching. Winter returned without ceremony, the kind of winter that did not ask permission or leave room for optimism. And when it came to Duluth, it came with the voice of the lake behind it, a long metallic howl that bent trees and scraped ice across glass like a blade testing its edge. The first warning was the sky, a flat white lid lowering itself over the neighborhood, followed by a temperature drop so abrupt, Walter Hayes felt it in his teeth. He moved with practiced economy, closing the adjustable vents he had built near the roofline of the glass enclosure, checking seals with bare fingers until they stung, treating the structure the way he once treated shelters in hostile places, tight, quiet, ready. Ranger followed every step, the German shepherd's thick coat already dusted with snow. Ears forward, body calm in that way dogs become when danger feels familiar rather than surprising. When the wind rose hard enough to make the glass hum, Walter stood still and listened, counting seconds between gusts, learning how the structure answered back. It flexed. It did not scream. That mattered. By nightfall, the blizzard arrived in earnest. Snow stacked against the outer walls in rising drifts, erasing the yard and turning the road into a suggestion. Inside the greenhouse space, the air held not warm exactly, but gentler, slowed like a held breath. Walter lit a modest fire in the cabin, no roaring blaze, just enough to remind the room what heat felt like. He sat at the small table with his back straight, hands wrapped around a mug, watching Ranger stretch out on the packed earth between glass and logs, the dog's chest rising and falling evenly. In previous winters, Ranger had slept tight and tense, tail-tucked muscles, ready to spring at every crack of ice. Tonight, he slept loose, one paw twitching in a dream belly, exposed to the faint daylight trapped from earlier hours. Walter felt something shift, then a subtle realignment inside his ribs, the kind that happens when fear realizes it has been outmaneuvered. The storm hammered through the night. Wind slammed into the glass and slid away, redirected by angles Walter had obsessed over for months. Snow climbed the walls and stopped piling higher outside while the inside ground stayed dark and soft. At some point before dawn, a sound cut through the wind, a thud, then another branches striking the enclosure. Walter rose instantly, jacket on boots pulled tight, opening the cabin door into the greenhouse space. The temperature change was immediate and unmistakable. His breath did not explode into white panic. He moved along the interior perimeter flashlight beam, skimming seals and frames, Ranger at his heel, the dog's low growl vibrating when a branch scraped too hard, then fading when the structure held. Nothing shattered. Nothing failed. Walter pressed a palm to the glass and felt the cold on the other side, distant, contained like an argument being conducted behind a closed door. Morning arrived pale and stunned. The blizzard had exhausted itself sometime before sunrise, leaving behind a world sculpted into hard angles and deep drifts. Outside, chimneys belched smoke as neighbors fought the cold, with desperation splitting wood in winds that stole heat faster than flames could replace it. Walter stepped into the greenhouse space wearing only a shirt sleeves rolled, feeling foolishly exposed and entirely comfortable. The air carried the smell of damp earth and resin. The ground beneath the glass had not frozen solid. It yielded slightly under his boots. He knelt and pressed his fingers into the soil, dark and receptive, and an idea he had held as theory for months finally crossed the line into proof. He scattered a small handful of cold seasoned seeds he had saved, spinach and kale, covering them lightly, almost ceremonially. Ranger watched, head tilted, as if this too were a patrol worth memorizing. Sarah Collins arrived before noon, trudging through snow that reached her calves. Her tall, lean frame wrapped in a long coat that flapped like a flag. Up close, her cheeks were raw with windburn, her pale eyes bright with the effort of staying upright. She stopped at the edge of the yard and stared not at Walter, but at the glass enclosure glowing faintly in the weak sun. "It's quieter in there," she said, when Walter waved her closer. Her voice dropped as she stepped inside, the wind's scream replaced by a muted hush. She took off her gloves, rubbing her hands together in disbelief. "It's warmer," she added, not smiling yet, as if warmth were something that required verification. Walter nodded, offering no speech to inflate the moment. Sarah's practicality took over. She walked the perimeter, examining seals, tapping a frame lightly with a knuckle. "You planned for this," she said, a statement rather than praise. Her respect showed in the way she stopped asking questions meant to trap an answer. Not long after, a figure struggled up the drive, hunched against the cold. It was Tom Reed, the local mail carrier, a compact man in his early 50s, with a square face reddened by years of wind, salt, and pepper stubble shadowing his jaw, eyes permanently narrowed against glare. He had a reputation for endurance, for delivering letters when others stayed home, and the storm had finally pushed him past stubbornness into need. "Truck's stuck," he said, breath ragged, stamping his feet. When Walter ushered him into the greenhouse, Tom's shoulders dropped involuntarily, as if someone had loosened a strap he'd forgotten he was wearing. "I'll be damned," he muttered, peeling off his hat, revealing hair flattened into obedient lines by sweat and wool. "Feels like stepping into another county." He did not laugh. He did not joke. He simply stood there, absorbing the difference, a man who understood gradients because his life depended on them. Walter offered coffee, and they drank it, standing steam, curling lazily instead of vanishing. Outside, winter continued its performance, indifferent and loud. Inside, the cold was reduced to a problem already solved. Tom left after his truck was freed, at gratitude expressed in a firm handshake and a promise to return with questions. Sarah lingered a moment longer, watching Ranger nose at the soil where seeds lay hidden. "If this holds," she said quietly, "people are going to want to know how." Walter looked at the glass, the snow beyond it, the line where chaos ended and control began. "It holds," he said, not boastful, just certain. As the day wore on, the greenhouse warmed, further sunlight stacking itself layer by layer in the trapped air. Walter recorded temperatures with the same care he once recorded coordinates, noting differences between outside and inside, watching the numbers separate, like opposing forces forced into retreat. He burned less wood that night than he had ever dared before the cabin, staying steady, the cold kept at arm's length. Ranger slept, stretched out again, content, dreaming in small kicks. Walter sat with his back to the wall, eyes closed, listening to the muted storm sounds filtered through glass. He thought of Evelyn not as a wound this time, but as an instruction finally honored. The blizzard had come. The cold had knocked. And for the first time he had not answered by surrendering. 3 days after the blizzard loosened its grip, when the snowbanks settled into hard blue shadows, and the town began counting losses instead of drifts, Brad Thompson made his way up Walter Hayes's drive. He did not walk so much as negotiate with the ground boots, dragging through crusted snow, shoulders hunched forward as if bracing for a wind that was no longer there. Brad was a man in his mid-40s who usually looked larger than he was broad, through the chest neck, thick from years of lifting and hauling beard trimmed close, in a way meant to suggest control. That morning control had abandoned him. His beard was uneven with ash eyes rimmed red from smoke and sleeplessness, cheeks hollowed by 3 nights of feeding a fire that refused to give back what it took. He had been the loudest voice when Walter first raised glass, the one whose laughter carried farthest and longest, as if mockery itself could keep winter at bay. Now he stopped at the edge of the yard and stared. Walter stood inside the greenhouse space jacket, unbuttoned sleeves rolled, hands bare. The air around him held a quiet warmth that felt almost indecent after days of cold. Ranger lay nearby, head up, watching Brad with steady amber eyes, the dog's body loose but ready like a gate that could close without warning. Brad took a step closer, then another, as if approaching a campfire that might vanish if he moved too quickly. When he crossed the threshold into the glass enclosure, his breath hitched, a reflex learned from years of cold shock. He looked around slowly, disbelief settling into his features, not as wonder, but as relief edged with grief. The ground beneath his boots was dark and soft instead of white and hostile. The wind's voice dropped to a murmur stripped of its authority. Brad swallowed hard. He did not speak at first. He removed his gloves, rubbing his hands together, skin cracked and raw fingers trembling slightly as warmth returned. He glanced at Walter, then away, as if eye contact required more courage than he had prepared. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Walter had ever heard it. "I was wrong," he said, the words shaped carefully like something fragile he could not afford to drop. He did not elaborate. He did not defend himself. He simply stood there, shoulders sagging, as if the admission had been carrying weight all along. Walter did not answer with triumph or lecture. He opened the cabin door wider and motioned Brad inside the greenhouse space, an invitation made with his whole body rather than words. Ranger watched Brad for a long moment, head tilted slightly, reading posture and breath, then turned away and lay down again, satisfied that the stranger brought no threat worth answering. Brad exhaled as if he had been holding something in since the storm began. Inside the enclosure, the difference felt unreal. Walter poured coffee into a battered mug and handed it over. Brad wrapped both hands around it, eyes closing briefly as heat seeped into his palms. He spoke then, haltingly, as if unsure which details mattered. His house, he explained, had always been drafty but manageable until the blizzard. The door warped under moisture and cold, leaving a gap that turned the living room into a corridor for wind. The chinking between logs failed in places he had never noticed, and every gust drove cold straight through bone and muscle. He burned wood constantly, feeding the fire until sparks leapt and smoke filled the room, but the warmth never stayed. His wife and 2 children slept in layers, waking to frost at the edges of blankets. By the second night, exhaustion had dulled fear into something heavier. He had sent his family to stay with relatives across town and remained behind trying to save a house that did not seem interested in being saved. Walter listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that people did not come seeking solutions until they had been emptied by the problem. When Brad finished, Walter gestured toward the glass walls, then the cabin logs beyond them. He explained simply, not with jargon, but with clarity born of long consideration. Light comes in. Light carries heat. The glass slows its escape. The air between the walls becomes a buffer, a place where cold loses its leverage. The ground absorbs warmth during the day and gives it back at night. The cabin no longer fights winter directly. It exists inside a different argument altogether. Brad nodded slowly, tracking each step, his practical mind engaging, now that disbelief had been replaced by need. Other neighbors appeared as the day went on, drawn by rumor more than curiosity. Sarah Collins' returned tall frame wrapped in a long coat. Her blonde hair pulled back tight, pale eyes alert. She stood quietly near the edge, letting Brad speak, watching his posture soften as the greenhouse worked its quiet persuasion. Tom Reed stopped by, briefly nodding once in confirmation rather than greeting. A few others lingered at a distance, arms crossed, expressions wary but attentive. The laughter that had once accompanied their visits was absent. In its place was a silence that felt heavier and more honest. Brad asked questions, then practical ones. How much glass? How deep the posts? How to keep it from overheating on clear days? Walter answered without guarding the knowledge, drawing diagrams with a finger in the dust, pointing out vents and seals, explaining mistakes he had made so Brad would not repeat them. He spoke of patience, of testing, before trusting, of building for the storm that arrives unannounced. When Brad finally asked the question that had been forming since he stepped inside, whether Walter would help him build one in the spring, Walter answered without hesitation. Yes, he said, the word steady and unadorned. Knowledge that saved lives was not something to hoard. Brad stood then taller than he had arrived, something like dignity returning to his posture. He shook Walter's hand, grip firm but careful, gratitude, plain and unembellished. I won't laugh again, he said, not as a promise to Walter, but to himself. Ranger rose and followed Brad to the edge of the enclosure, watching him leave, then returned to his place in the warmth without ceremony. As evening settled, Walter closed the vents and lit a small fire, the cabin holding heat with a calm that still surprised him. He watched the greenhouse glow faintly in the fading light glass, catching the last color of the sky. He thought of Evelyn, then, not with the sharp ache of before, but with a quieter recognition. Her death had carved this path, had forced him to question rules everyone else accepted as fixed. He had not undone the loss. He had changed what followed it. Outside, winter continued its work, indifferent and relentless. Inside, the glass laughter melted into understanding, and a secret once mocked began to travel, carried not by rumor, but by warmth that could be felt. In the end, this story was never really about glass, wood, or even winter. It was about a quiet kind of miracle, the kind that doesn't arrive with thunder or fire, but with understanding. Some people wait for God to remove the storm. Others are guided gently and patiently to build shelter before it arrives. Walter didn't defeat the cold by strength or pride. He was given an idea at the exact moment he needed it most, and he had the courage to act on it. That, too, is grace. In our own lives, we face winters that have nothing to do with snow. Loss, fear, loneliness, and uncertainty can feel just as brutal. And often the miracle isn't that the pain disappears. It's that God shows us how to live through it, how to protect what matters, and how to turn suffering into something that saves others. Sometimes the answer to our prayers comes not as escape, but as wisdom, persistence, and the strength to try again. If this story touched you, let it be a reminder. Pay attention to the quiet ideas, the small nudges, the thoughts that arrive when you're broken, but still willing to hope. They may be God's way of helping you build your own shelter. Before you go, share this story with someone who needs warmth today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, your city, your state, or your country. We read everyone. And if you believe stories like this matter, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide your steps through every season of your life.